What if everything you learned about the Dust Bowl was incomplete? What if the greatest environmental catastrophe in American history was not primarily caused by drought, but by a deliberate choice that farmers and the government made together? What if the Dust Bowl was not something that happened to America, but something America did to itself? Between 1930 and 1939, the Great Plains of the United States experienced what historians call the Dust Bowl. Millions of tons of topsoil were blown away by wind. Entire towns were buried under dust. Families lost everything. Hundreds of thousands of people migrated west to California seeking work. The official narrative says this was a natural disaster, a drought combined with unfortunate timing, an act of God that no one could have prevented. But the evidence tells a different story. A story about how the richest agricultural region in the world was deliberately transformed into a wasteland through a combination of government policy, corporate greed, and the abandonment of traditional farming practices that had sustained the land for thousands of years. The story begins not in 1930, but in 1917. The United States had just entered the First World War. Europe was starving. Wheat prices had tripled. The government launched a campaign called "Wheat Will Win the War." The message was simple and powerful. Plant more wheat. Plant as much wheat as possible. The government guaranteed high prices. The government promised unlimited demand. American farmers responded. Between 1917 and 1920, wheat acreage in the Great Plains increased from approximately 35 million acres to approximately 75 million acres. The amount of land dedicated to wheat production more than doubled in just 3 years. To accomplish this expansion, farmers did something that had never been done before on this scale. They plowed up the native prairie. The Great Plains had been covered for thousands of years by native grasses. These grasses had deep root systems that held the soil in place. These grasses had evolved to survive drought. These grasses had evolved to survive wind. But these grasses did not produce wheat. So farmers plowed them under. They used new tractors and plows that made this possible. The sod-buster plow, invented in 1893, could cut through the tough prairie sod. The tractor, which became widely available after 1915, could pull these plows across vast areas of land. For the first time in history, it was economically feasible to plow up the entire prairie. The government encouraged this. The Department of Agriculture published pamphlets showing farmers how to maximize wheat production. The railroads, which profited from shipping wheat, encouraged this. The banks, which financed the purchase of tractors and equipment, encouraged this. Everyone with financial interest in wheat production encouraged farmers to plant more. And the farmers, seeing the high prices and the guaranteed demand, complied. They plowed up the prairie. They planted wheat. They made money. For a few years, it was the most profitable agriculture had ever been. But in 1920, the war ended. Suddenly, the demand for wheat disappeared. Prices collapsed. They fell from $3.50 per bushel in 1919 to 98 cents per bushel in 1921. Farmers who had invested heavily in equipment and land found themselves unable to pay their debts. Many went bankrupt. Many abandoned their farms, but the land remained plowed. The native prairie was gone. The soil was exposed. For the next decade, the Great Plains experienced relatively normal rainfall. The wheat grew. The farmers survived. The disaster seemed to have passed. But the soil had been fundamentally changed. The native prairie grasses that had held the soil together for thousands of years were gone. The soil had been compacted by tractors. The soil had been depleted of nutrients by continuous wheat monoculture. The soil had been stripped of the organic matter that held it together. The land was now vulnerable in a way it had never been before. Then, in 1930, the drought came. It was not an unusual drought. The Great Plains experienced droughts regularly, but this time the land could not handle it. The wheat died, the fields were left bare, and when the wind came, there was nothing to hold the soil in place. The soil simply blew away. The dust storms began in 1931. They started small, a few inches of dust in the air, but they grew progressively worse. By 1933, the dust storms were so severe that they blocked out the sun at midday. Farmers reported that they could not see their hands in front of their faces. The dust was so fine that it penetrated every building. It got into food, it got into water, it got into lungs. Respiratory diseases increased dramatically. Children developed a condition called dust pneumonia. Cattle died from eating dust-covered grass. The dust storms were so severe that they reached the East Coast. In 1934, dust from the Great Plains fell on New York City. It fell on Washington, D.C. It fell on ships in the Atlantic Ocean. The entire nation could see what was happening in the Great Plains. But here is the crucial fact that the official narrative often omits. The drought that caused the Dust Bowl was not unusually severe. The National Weather Service has records going back to 1895. The drought of 1936 was severe, but not the most severe on record. The drought of 1994 was actually more severe. The drought of 1956 was more severe, yet those droughts did not produce dust bowls. Why? Because by 1994 and 1956, farmers had replanted native grasses. They had restored the prairie. They had learned the lesson of the 1930s. The Dust Bowl was not caused by drought alone. It was caused by the combination of drought and the removal of native prairie. And the removal of native prairie was a deliberate choice. It was not inevitable. It was not necessary. It was a choice made by farmers who were responding to economic incentives created by government policy and corporate interests. The government's role in this disaster is often overlooked. The Department of Agriculture actively encouraged farmers to plow up the prairie. The government guaranteed prices for wheat during the war. The government did not warn farmers about the risks of monoculture. The government did not encourage farmers to maintain native grasses as a buffer against drought. The government did not regulate land use. The government simply encouraged production and left farmers to deal with the consequences. The banks also played a crucial role. Banks financed the purchase of tractors and equipment. Banks encouraged farmers to take on debt. Banks foreclosed on farms when farmers could not pay their debts. Between 1930 and 1935, approximately 200,000 farms were foreclosed. Farmers lost their land. The land was consolidated into larger operations. The larger operations continued to plant wheat monoculture. The problem got worse, not better. The corporations that manufactured tractors and equipment also played a role. They marketed their products aggressively. They encouraged farmers to buy the latest technology. They financed purchases through credit. They profited from the expansion of wheat production. When the Dust Bowl came, they did not suffer. The farmers suffered. The land suffered. But the corporations that had encouraged the expansion continued to profit. By 1935, the situation had become catastrophic. Approximately 100 million acres of land in the Great Plains had been damaged by erosion. Approximately 300,000 people had migrated out of the Great Plains. The agricultural economy of the region had collapsed. The government finally intervened. The Soil Conservation Service was created in 1935. The government began paying farmers to plant native grasses instead of wheat. The government began implementing soil conservation practices. But this was 5 years too late. 5 years of catastrophic erosion had already occurred. The recovery took decades. It was not until the 1940s and 1950s that the Great Plains began to recover. Farmers replanted native grasses. They implemented crop rotation. They reduced the use of monoculture. They learned to work with the land instead of against it. The prairie began to recover. The soil began to stabilize. The dust storms stopped, but the human cost was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their livelihoods. Families that had farmed the same land for generations were forced to abandon it. Children grew up in poverty. Entire communities were destroyed. The psychological impact was devastating. The social impact was devastating. The economic impact was devastating. What we learn from the Dust Bowl is that environmental disasters are not always natural. They are often the result of human choices. The Dust Bowl was caused by a deliberate decision to plow up the prairie in order to maximize wheat production. It was caused by government policy that encouraged this decision. It was caused by corporate interests that profited from this decision. It was caused by the abandonment of traditional farming practices that had sustained the land for thousands of years. The Dust Bowl also teaches us about the psychology of short-term thinking. Farmers saw high wheat prices and high demand. They made the rational decision to plant more wheat. They did not consider the long-term consequences. They did not consider what would happen if prices fell. They did not consider what would happen if drought came. They focused on immediate profit. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. Individuals making rational decisions in the short term that lead to catastrophic consequences in the long term. The Dust Bowl also teaches us about the importance of regulation and government oversight. The government encouraged farmers to plow up the prairie without warning them about the risks. The government did not regulate land use. The government did not require farmers to maintain soil conservation practices. The government only intervened after the disaster had already occurred. This is a lesson that remains relevant today. Environmental protection requires proactive government action, not reactive response after the damage is done. The Dust Bowl also teaches us about the importance of traditional knowledge. The native prairie had evolved over thousands of years to survive drought and wind. The native grasses had deep root systems that held the soil in place. The native prairie was a sustainable system that could be maintained indefinitely, but farmers abandoned this system in pursuit of short-term profit. They replaced it with monoculture wheat production. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. The abandonment of traditional practices in pursuit of modern efficiency often leads to unforeseen consequences. Today, the Great Plains have recovered. The prairie has been partially restored. Farmers have learned the lessons of the Dust Bowl, but the same pressures that led to the Dust Bowl still exist. Commodity prices fluctuate. Government policies encourage certain crops over others. Corporate interests profit from agricultural expansion. Farmers face pressure to maximize production. The question is whether we have truly learned the lessons of the Dust Bowl, or whether we are simply repeating the same mistakes in different forms. The Dust Bowl was not a natural disaster. It was a human mistake. It was a mistake made by farmers responding to economic incentives. It was a mistake encouraged by government policy. It was a mistake that profited corporations. It was a mistake that cost hundreds of thousands of people their homes and livelihoods. It was a mistake that damaged the land for decades. And it was a mistake that could have been prevented if we had valued long-term sustainability over short-term profit. What mistakes are we making today that will be revealed as catastrophic in 50 years? What are we doing to the land in pursuit of short-term profit that will damage it for generations? What traditional practices are we abandoning in pursuit of modern efficiency? These are the questions that the Dust Bowl forces us to ask. These are the questions that we must answer if we want to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.